Okay, so let's look at Standard 19A. See. Okay, so investigate the origins of U.S. involvement in the war. That's World War II, including Lend-Lease and Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Okay, so the events that were going on in Europe were threatening the American allies and their trade. And so we're going to look at how the U.S. handles that. And also, it's one thing that's important to keep in mind is many Americans during this point in time were reluctant to get involved in this European conflict because of the events that occurred during World War I. And so after World War I, everyone was just really sad. Like, why was this war fought? What was accomplished? And not really anybody had answers. And so they're reluctant to get involved in yet another war. Okay, causes of World War II. In many ways, it is said that World War I, in all of its sadness, led directly to World War II because the Treaty of Versailles caused anger and resentment in Europe. Germany resented the blame for the war and the loss of colonies and border territories. Russia resented the loss of lands used to create other nations. And new democracies were floundering under all of the social and economic problems that were happening, and so they weren't flourishing because everyone, not just the U.S., went through the Great Depression after World War I. Dictators rose during this point in time, and they were driven by nationalism and the desire for more territory. You have Hitler, Mussolini, and the like. So what about the U.S.? Americans became isolationists once again, and so they want to stay to themselves. They don't want to get involved in foreign affairs. FDR was in favor of supporting the Allies, but he backed away from foreign policy. Remember, he was more about domestic policy to begin with. That's what he campaigned upon is helping the United States. From 1935 to 1939, 5 neutrality acts were passed to try to keep the U.S. out of the future wars. They outlawed the arms sales, loans to other nations at war, but neutrality began to break down. In 1937, Japan launched a new attack on China, and FDR sent aid to China. FDR wanted to isolate aggressor nations, particularly the Nazis, to try to stop war. 1939, FDR got Congress to pass a cash and carry provision. This argued that Britain and France, if they were to defeat Hitler, then it could possibly keep the U.S. out of war. So let's help them now. So instead of us giving them the money and us going over to Britain and delivering the supplies, it argued that France and Britain had to come and pay cash for supplies and come pick them up from the United States. We were not going to take our chances with our German submarine warfare. Whereas, before or during World War I, we would try to take supplies over to our allied nations and we would get sunk by German submarines. So we wanted to help. So the U.S. had this cash and carry policy starting in 1939 because we could not afford for Britain and France to lose because of trade reasons. 1940, U.S. had to change this for FDR to try to provide Britain all aid short of war because we're running out of money. So all of a sudden we have to start loaning money as well. Japan, Germany, and Italy signed the Tripartite Pact, which was a mutual defense treaty, and they became known as the Axis powers. FDR says if Britain falls, the Axis powers will be free to conquer the world, and the U.S. must become the arsenal of democracy, meaning the U.S. is now responsible for creating all things that were needed in war to protect democracy in the world at large. So by late 1940, Britain has no more cash to buy U.S. arms, and the U.S. was still able to support allies while officially remaining neutral. So we became the arsenal of democracy. So Lend-Lease Act is put in place because there's no more cash. So you can't have cash and carry. It's replaced by Lend-Lease Act. and because Great Britain didn't have the money for cash and carry policy. Congress passed the Lend-Lease Act. U.S. could lend military equipment and supplies to any nation the U.S. said was vital to the defense of the U.S., so any allied nation. So in October 1941, FDR approved $1 billion in Lend-Lease aid to Great Britain. And by the time the U.S. entered World War II, which was in December 1941, just a few months later, $50 billion worth of equipment and supplies had already been sent to Great Britain, France, Soviet Union, and China. All right, so let's talk about Japan. Japan was a resource-poor nation. They are just this little island here, and so they don't have a lot of their own resources. They have a lot of people and not enough resources to keep its industries going and to feed its people. So as early as the 1980s, Japan began to try to expand. They targeted weaker nations of China and Korea and captured territory from both of those nations. Japan's aggression on China angered the U.S. because under U.S. policy, all nations should be able to trade freely in China, the open door policy, and respect their territorial integrity. But Japan invades Manchuria in 1931 and engaged China in a full-scale war in 1937. China was quickly conquered except for the southwestern provinces. And so you see on this map the areas of the growth of Japan's empire. And so those are all the areas they take in, and it shows when they took them. So Korea, Manchuria, Johor, etc. Okay, the U.S. placed an embargo on Japan. So the neutrality laws prevented the U.S. from giving aid to China. However, Lend-Lease law in 1931 allowed the U.S. to lend money to Chinese war effort. So in 1940, Germany conquered France and the Netherlands and threatened Great Britain, and the conquered nations also had rich colonial holdings in Asia. September 1940, Japanese occupied French Indochina, threatening British Malaysia, the Dutch East Indies, and the American Philippines. So all of these rich colonial holdings in Asia, Japan threatens those. So the U.S. immediately placed an embargo on the airplane parts and aviation fuel. U.S. also repositioned the Pacific Fleet from San Diego to the Hawaiian Islands. And in July 1941, the U.S. placed a total financial and oil embargo on Japan. So an embargo is a ban, meaning they're not going to trade or give oil to Japan. And Japan needs that trade in that oil. So the Japanese felt threatened by the U.S. because of these embargoes, because of these bans. And so they began to plan operations to take over the East Indies, the Malay Peninsula, and the Philippines. And to prevent a counterattack, the Japanese military felt it was necessary to destroy the American Pacific Fleet. So December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. This was the home of the U.S. Pacific Fleet and the U.S. Navy Deepwater Naval Base. So remember, the U.S. had moved from San Diego to the Hawaiian Islands. So this is Pearl Harbor. This is where they have their Pacific Fleet. 2,403 Americans were killed, 1,178 were wounded, and over 300 aircraft and 19 ships were destroyed. And because of the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the attack on Pearl Harbor, Congress approved FDR's request for the declaration of war against Japan. Germany and Italy declare war on the U.S. as a result of their declaration of war on Japan, because remember, they're part of the tripartite pact, the Axis powers. And all of a sudden, the U.S. has to fight on not only the Pacific front, but also the European front as well. Okay, and that is it for this standard. Thank you for watching. Oh, sorry.